Okay, thanks. Yeah, so this talk is going to be about value added. There's large investments in Lidar, as we've heard. There's been large investments in doing plots and characterizing biodiversity. And ideally we should be bringing those together. And it's also a collaboration with Nicholas Scoops at UBC and Barry White and Chris Bader and at GOA in my lab about trying to bring together these tools and data sets. Why do we do this? Well, the environment and biodiversity are big issues around disturbances. We work a lot in Northeast Alberta and the oil sands, the in situ oil sands, SAGD. And issues of those disturbances, policies around those disturbances, people talking about the land use framework and planning, biodiversity management framework as indicators and thresholds, maybe offsets, mitigation offsets, environmental assessments. All those things are dependent on information and knowledge about some form of the environment or biodiversity or indicators of interest. And there's much work done on monitoring and mitigation, and it's combining the technology and tools such as Lidar, kind of depth to water, or the Lidar Vegetation Metrics to address some of these questions. So I'm basically going to give a quick overview of 5 different projects in the lab that take use of these technologies. I'll give a few examples of some species-specific work that's been done on plant diversity and rarity for the Northeast Alberta. I'll pick on one species. It's not a rare species by any stretch of the imagination, but is valued from First Nations or other cultural resources for berry picking, but also wildlife, blueberry, velvetleaf blueberry. And then I'll focus on some habitat, kind of ecosystem scale questions, mapping old growth forest, which are good indicators for certain species, birds and things like that. Fen health associated with linear disturbances. And I know Nicholas suggested staying away from UAVs, consumer grade UAVs, but we've spent quite a bit of time of using not $10 UAVs, but $600 or $800 UAVs with a camera that costs about the same to basically do photogrammetry structure from motion. We're not putting Lidar on these UAVs, it's basically getting canopy height. And where you have fairly open canopies and small scale questions, such as disturbances on seismic lines and well pads, I think it can be used at that very fine scale for fairly reasonable cost. I'll show you an example of that. So this first topic of plant diversity, kind of the hot spots and rarity, over the last 4 years, we've done 606 quarter hectare plots. That it kind of complements the ABMI program. The ABMI monitoring program is a grid every 20 kilometers, but it undersamples all the rare habitats because it's systematic. It's not stratified in any way. So what we've done is we've changed protocols in 2 ways. One, we changed the protocol of we actually stratify, and we're very particular about where we go. We go to places we think there's going to be rarity. And second of all, we changed the protocols to try to enhance detections of rare species, rare plants. And the overall objective of that project is, monitoring in the SAGD in situ to fill gaps that ABMI is not able to measure, mitigation planning and habitat mapping, coordinate pre-disturbance assessments. So there's a lot of work done prior to developments. Pre-disturbance assessments are done to assess the ecosite and rare species. But rarely is that information coordinated across leases and coordinated across larger areas such as a land use framework boundary such as the Lower Athabasca. And informed status assessments, maybe some of these rare plants, we don't know enough about them. There's data and information gaps. And so we're trying to fill those data and information gaps to further prioritize which species we put conservation efforts towards. And we use the Ducks Unlimited enhanced wetland classification for some of that stratification, and there's a lot of other topoedaphic and other factors that try to predict where we think rarity is, and each year that changes, so it's adaptive, and it's a model-based adaptive sampling approach. First of all, the rarity, some of the models we first derived, this does not include Lidar data, so I should preface this, but this includes kind of traditional other geospatial data sets, other digital elevation model derived variables, topoedaphic factors basically, so soil pH, terrain position index, heat load, solar radiation type things, and some of that ducks and limited enhanced wetland classification to try to say where are places more or less likely to encounter rare plants. So here the way we define rare plants was an S1 or S2, and that means it's a subnational status of an S1, critically imperiled, usually less than a dozen known populations in the province. S2, maybe 30 or 40 populations at most known. The red areas indicate those environmental factors that tend to be the topoedaphic and habitat factors that correlate quite well with where we more consistently encounter rare species. So the yellow dot locations are the plots where we encountered either an S1 or S2 species, and the black ones that we did not. The red areas are predicted to be potential habitat. To just give you an idea, I'm just going to pick on a few habitats here, and I'll refer to this odds ratio. An odds ratio is how much more likely is that event to happen, in this case, detecting or finding a rare species on a site, given some reference condition, which in this case we used a reference of deciduous forest. So for instance, a graminoid poor fen is 53 times more likely to have an S1 or S2 plant at it than a deciduous forest. So a lot more likely. It's also a lot less likely in the landscape from an aerial perspective. The footprint of poor graminoid fens there's not much of it, like 1% or less in the lower Athabasca. So that really kind of helps prioritize and identify important sites. So one of the questions is, can we then add additional value to this using some of the Lidar data sets? So here is, first of all, the depth to water model here. And, excuse me, because I actually put dark blue to be dry and dark light to be wet, mostly because visually it was too dark if you flipped it around. So light blue is closer to the water table, basically. But you see that the dark blue areas are the areas that in this part of the boreal forest, Conklin to Fort McMurray, there's a lot of treed fens and peatlands, and so it's very wet overall. And it's only very specific terrain locations that you tend to get much drier ecosites. So here on the right side is the modeled relationship or the predicted relationship. First of all, richness, plant richness is, canopy height is a really good predictor, which is kind of like old growth scenarios. Topographic position, so very specific kind of terrain features. And if you look back on that past map, you probably saw some ravines and things that probably increase microsites and wet seeps and things like that. And then depth to water, which is what I'm showing here. So if we go from wet to dry, we actually increase total plant richness moving up the gradient and finding these drier type sites or the sides of major river valleys. And graminoids in the orange have a very similar pattern. So graminoids and total richness are pretty similar. Now, the Canopy Height model, so not only depth to water, but we can also use the Lidar Vegetation Metrics. So on the left side is the canopy height at the 99th percentile. So that is, what is the height for the top 1% of point cloud? So it's pretty much the maximum canopy height. You don't necessarily use the absolute maximum because maybe there's a cell tower or a bird or something else that may bias it a bit. So frequently 95th or 99th centile or percentage is used for height. So green areas have much higher canopy or vegetation heights. And this is the predicted relationship or the hotspots of richness. And these very specific terrain features, which the terrain features affect not only the wet areas mapping, but also the canopy relationships. And those things both help predict overall the locations of rarity or the hotspots, with the red areas being the areas with the highest total vascular plant diversity. If you break this up into specific groups, like just the forbs or just the graminoids, First of all, the graminoids on the right side, so the red and orange areas tend to be more of these peatlands, more wet areas. There's, again, a strong positive relationship with depth to water and graminoid richness. While forb richness is not driven by depth to water kind of factors at all, but it is quite predicted well with Canopy metrics, the Lidar vegetation metrics overall. And you'll notice that these are kind of inverse of each other. So areas that have high forb diversity tend to have low graminoid diversity of sedges and grasses. The second example I wanted to look at is a specific species in blueberries. So we've been working in the lab on fruiting shrubs for quite a while. And these things are important for First Nations, other recreational users, wildlife. So we've done a lot of work on grizzly bears and other wildlife and that use this pulse of resources and energy that comes at the late summer period that's important for a number of species. It's also maybe possibly a future indicator for the biodiversity management framework for Lower Athabasca. The issue is it's actually fairly common in the boreal forest. It's not anything we'd typically worry about, but really good key locations for fruiting resources that are at high productivity are actually much rarer. So I was interested in looking at, in this case, there was 21 different fruiting shrubs I looked at across the Lower Athabasca, from taller shrubs like the cherries, chokecherry and pincherry, down to dwarf species such as the iricaceae and the blueberries, the vacciniums. So this would be one example, one of the 21 models of the fruiting shrubs, in this case for velvetleaf blueberry, Vaccinium myrtleoides. And I used two data sets to do this. The first was back on that rare plant project, we inventoried all possible species in the quarter-hectare plot. But it was just a presence-absence data set. We did not have information on total abundance and shrub cover, fruit production, fruit quality. So I had a project, a 2-year project between 2014 and 2015 that just ended with SEMA, where we did 335 additional plots, essentially quarter-hectare plots, where we measured shrub abundance, fruit production, fruit quality using the sugars with Brix levels, so much more detailed information. So here, the black locations, well, yeah, there's blueberry almost everywhere in the Lower Athabasca. This is the probability of occurrence, with blue areas being higher, more likely. If you make a decision, a threshold of saying, yeah, it's probably there or not, the orange areas are areas that are going to probably find blueberry. Gray areas less so. But that next step, using a subsample of these sites where we had information on shrub abundance, that's where I modeled the total shrub cover. And the blue areas in certain places, some places are because of burns, that there's an increase overall in shrub cover of blueberry. Now I don't show the next model, the next map, which is total fruit production. And this is the situation that happened. Total fruit production, there's some really weak relationships to some environmental factors, like soils and things like that, but generally it's driven by two things that we probably would already know: canopy cover and the total abundance of the shrub in the plot to begin with. And the issue is with across the whole Lower Athabasca, although we now have some more information on the Lidar metrics, at the time I didn't really have that. So the map for fruit production would look exactly the same as shrub abundance because I didn't have a highly accurate canopy map, basically. But for one area that we do have much more information on, both the wet areas mapping and canopy, is again this area in the northeast Alberta. Areas of high percent canopy cover over DBH height are in green, and areas that there's an inverse relationship, as you'd imagine. You increase canopy cover, you're going to shut down fruit production in things like blueberry. So the blue areas here are now areas where there must be a lot of blueberry to begin with. So think back to those other models. There must be semi-open to open canopy cover. So these would be, the places that have more likely fruit production are much rarer than the overall extent of blueberry overall. But what I really wanted to do is I'm interested in doing some management actions that could be offsets, enhancements, something like that. So, in other places like Eastern Canada, places in the United States, they'd use prescribed fire or thinning and try to boost fruit production. So what I did here was I looked at the canopy cover model, the overall total fruit production, and by doing a simulated thinning or a certain removal of canopy to reach optimal fruit production, I could look at the change in total fruit production from what it is now predicted to what could be under conditions of a management intervention or enhancement. So now the areas in the darker color, blues, are those places that those would be the places to go to if someone was requesting some enhancements or increases in a resource such as blueberry fruit. Now you'd have to have understory protection, or if it was more of a forestry operation. But we're trying to do an experiment where we're using thinning at small scales to look at the effectiveness of using these models to identify places to go for offsets and enhancements. So now moving into kind of away from species and more into kind of ecosystem measures. One thing that gets a lot of attention is old growth forests, or the rare on the landscape. We need to identify them, protect them, or manage them, although fire and other disturbances, it's always a dynamic process. But what I did was I took advantage of the Lidar data again from Chris Bader and Nicholas Coops, and looked at, well, what are the factors that limit things like really tall canopy, like old growth kind of scenarios? Well, the three things that I found are, basically an interaction between mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation. So the warmer it is and the drier it is, at least in that area, so let's say Conklin to Fort McMurray, the higher the canopy height, the higher the maximum canopy height. And depth to water, if you get too close to the water table, you're going to reduce that overall potential canopy height. And the way I did this was focus on the problem is if you take the canopy, the existing canopy from Lidar, it's extremely noisy. There's burns, there's clear cuts, there's all kinds of activities out there. So you can't really just model the relationship between depth to water and height of canopy. But you can do that if you focus only on like the 90th centile of possible heights on the landscape. So you don't worry about all the other noise, you look at the maximum and model the maximum. And by doing that, depth to water ended up being a really important predictor. And you don't even really need the statistical model to look at. You just, the pattern is there. Here's the depth to water. Here's maximum canopy height at the 99th centile. See the green and the green, river valleys and river valleys? I mean, it almost matches 1-to-1, not quite. There's some variation in there. But the depth to water with climate and an interaction between mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation is a pretty good, there's a pretty good relationship. So this would be, on the left here, this would be potential height with no disturbance. So I wanted to do that because I want to eventually identify places that are more old growth like characteristics. So climatically and depth to water wise, the green areas tend to be places you're going to get up into 30 meter to 45 meter canopy heights. But this is also the maximum height you'd expect. The heights on top of the Stony Mountain are going to be much shorter, more peatland, more higher elevation. It's not real high, but it's still higher. So it's going to limit that overall height. So the map on the right says that, okay, which sites actually are observed to be at the potential maximum given the environmental constraints of that area. If you're high elevation and you're wet, you're a treed fen, you're probably not going to be very tall, but you could still be an old growth at 19 meters or 23 meters. So it essentially corrects for the environmental differences and really highlights those places that are really tall vegetation, tall canopies that are characteristic of the site's suitability. The other kind of ecosystem level question that we're addressing in the lab with Caitlin Willier, a master's student, is looking at essentially fen health or kind of the fen community overall. And these communities can be quite sensitive. There's flow associated with it, so changes in flow are going to possibly disturb the site and influence community dynamics. And so what she's doing is she's looking at linear disturbances relative to changes in the structure and community composition, the assemblage of plants. And so in yellow here is the landscape management plans for the lower Athabasca locations of the amounts of fen habitat within quarter sections. So there's fens kind of scattered all over. And of course, we have quite a bit of linear disturbances. This doesn't include the seismic lines, but pipelines and roads and power lines kind of fragment these fens, dissect them, and one of the questions is to what degree does that affect it? Well, this is an example, one of Caitlin's plots, where this is the dry side of the road, this is the wet side of the road. So on the wet side where there's flooding and mortality of the original kind of more semi-open treed fen is switched to more of a wet graminoid sedge system. And on the other side, you're actually really increasing the total tree growth on the dry side because you're drying it out, allowing better tree recruitment. So what she's looking at is with vegetation. Well, here's an example, kind of Google Earth type image, the wet side versus the dry side with a road through it. And basically asking the question, well, of course, being perpendicular to the flow is probably a problem. What is the effect of culverts? Well, sometimes culverts speed the flow, and the dry side becomes a flooded side, and the other side becomes dry, so it's quite complicated. But some of these patterns show up consistently in the Lidar data. So here's an example of the Lidar metrics at 20 of our sites. The brown areas are the dry side with the total cover, tree cover above DBH height, up to 80% on some and very low in others. And if you summarize this across the areas and compare them to control fens right here, the dry side, you're going to increase tree recruitment significantly different and decrease it on the wet side. So we can identify with the Lidar which fens are being impacted and which ones aren't with linear disturbances. So the last quick thing on the UAVs is, I do think that they're still a useful tool at very local scales. And like the Lidar that we're very interested in, canopy and vegetation metrics and so on, questions around linear disturbances like 3D or 2D seismic lines. Some of these are quite narrow, and provincial Lidar data sets, there's a lot of points, but still the point densities of the traditional data sets available are roughly 1.2 points per square meter. When you're dealing with, let's say, a 2.8 meter wide seismic line, that's still not that's not that dense. So using photogrammetry and structure from motion with a inexpensive UAV, this is a true colored dense point cloud with 2,500 points per square meter. So it's a 2 centimeter resolution colored point cloud with seismic lines and disturbances that we can track through time. And down below is the digital surface model of that same study site. And here's an example of comparing two different seismic lines. One that in this bar chart here in the box plot, this is the seismic line itself, and these two are the adjacent control lines through the treed fen. Quite a bit different, still open. This one with some more tree recruitment is fairly similar. So the issue is, we can get a lot more information by using the UAV or Lidar and pairing them together than trying to measure by hand all the individual structures on seismic lines, which takes quite a bit of time. And we kind of shortcut it through using this technology. So last slide here is kind of other applications. Well, it'd be great to continue to link the data sets, the investments in the data sets with biodiversity data sets in some way. We want to leverage those investments. People are talking about framing the biodiversity management framework, basically identifying indicators for management. Eventually those indicators need to be monitored. It's unlikely they're going to be directly monitored themselves. A lot of times it'll be proxies of that, so the habitat associations. Probably remote sensing will be a major tool for that. So right now, fens, rare plants, things like that are being considered for biodiversity management framework indicators. Management and restoration, tools and targets to prioritize and do restoration actions. So I gave you an example, like the Blueberry enhancement kind of model, offsets, kind of same principles. And the more that we use this, the more that we'll have people trained to take advantage of the data sets, and the student training and opportunities to collaborate is important for integrating within provincial land use and forest planning. So Acknowledgements, the Lidar Biodiversity Project with Nicholas Coops and Barry White and Chris Bader, and the ABMI Application Center for the rare plant work with Dan Farr, Monica Kohler, and Verena Chrisfield. COSIA Alberta Biodiversity Conservation Chairs really helps collect a lot of that biodiversity data. And the graduate students like Caitlin Willier on fens, Federico Riva, butterflies will be using some of this, Tobias Tan, who did the seismic line work, Matt Robinson, Lingfen Mao is the postdoc who's working on the LIDAR data set, and Quinn Barber as well, who's worked on LIDAR in Southwest Alberta.